Today on the newscast, Israel begins major military and civilian drills to prepare for a future war with Hezbollah. Find out more coming up. Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. We've been telling you here over the past several months that Israel is preparing for a major confrontation to its north. I'm talking in particular about Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Hezbollah and its Iranian master in Syria, Israel's northern front. Here on the newscast, we have called it the coming Great Northern War. Israeli officials say it's not a question of if, but when this conflict breaks out, instigated by Iran and Hezbollah, who are determined to establish a foothold on Israel's northern borders from which they can launch attacks against the Jewish state. Well, Israel is preparing for this, as I mentioned, and that preparation has intensified this week. Right now, the Israeli military, all branches of the Israel Defense Forces, are engaged in Operation Hewn Stone. It began this week. It will last for the better part of the coming month. And again, it involves Israel, every branch of the Israel Defense Forces, preparing in specific for the northern threat. What does that mean? Well, they are preparing for, of course, Hezbollah's rocket and missile arsenal, which they have stored in southern Lebanon, at least 150,000 rockets and missiles aimed at every inch of Israel, including at least a small number of those precision-guided missiles, or PGMs, that we've told you about here on the newscast. Folks, they do exactly what their name says. They hit the target with greater precision and accuracy. That is a red line Israel will not allow Hezbollah to cross. More on that in a minute. So they're preparing for the missile and rocket barrages that would come in this future conflict with Hezbollah. According to Israel Defense Forces officials, they expect that Hezbollah would fire up to 2,000 rockets per day in that coming conflict with Israel. Now, just to put that into context, back in the May 2021 war, pitting Israel against Iran's other proxies, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, those terror groups launched close to 4,500 rockets against Israel over an 11-day span. That's a lot, right? Well, Hezbollah, we're talking 2,000 rockets per day. 4,500 over 11 days, 2,000 per day. Big difference. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, obviously very dangerous, and certainly they will throw their hats in the ring as well and try to create a second front and a diversion as Israel goes toe-to-toe with Iran and Hezbollah to the north. But the Hamas Islamic Jihad threat, although very serious, pales in comparison, folks, to the severity of the Hezbollah threat. And that's why this massive drill is underway right now. The Israeli Home Front Command is also doing a separate drill focused on civilians and civilian population centers and what this coming war would mean for them, which means, folks, very likely mass evacuations of Israeli communities near the Israel-Lebanon border. Now, think back to that 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. It's become known as the Second Lebanon War. That was the last major confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah. There were mass evacuations of Israeli cities and towns near the Lebanon border. I'm thinking of a place like Kiryat Shimona, where civilians were under the constant and steady barrage of Hezbollah rockets. And of course, Hezbollah's arsenal, as I mentioned a minute ago, has grown to at least 150,000 rockets and missiles today, 15 years after that last conflict. So this is a different level, certainly, and civilians will be profoundly affected in Israel's communities to the north. And that's not even mentioning the rockets that could come from Syria as well. We're focusing on southern Lebanon, Hezbollah's main power base, but again, Iran and Hezbollah have that presence near Israel's border in Syria as well. And we here in the newscast, it's not just rockets and missiles, folks. We have shown you here in the newscast and on the Watchman TV show on TBN how we have gone inside Hezbollah terror tunnels that Hezbollah has dug along the Israel-Lebanon border. Now, the IDF uncovered 6 of those tunnels. Are there more? We hope not, obviously, but Hezbollah's plan was to mount also a ground invasion of the northern areas of Israel, and in the words of Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, even seize the Galilee. That was the plan. Hopefully that is off the table now that these terror tunnels were exposed a few years ago. So what Israel is doing, very wisely in my view, is making sure that the Israeli military and Israeli civilians, key point there, are prepared for what is coming. Folks, again, this is an eventuality. The showdown between Israel and Hezbollah and the Iranian regime to the north, because Iran and Hezbollah will not back off. Israel realizes this, and they realize that eventually you can't allow an existential threat to fester and to develop on your borders. That's exactly what Iran and Hezbollah have done over the past several years, with the intent, again, to destroy the Jewish state. So eventually, the day will come where there is a reckoning. No one wants to see it, but thanks to Iran and Hezbollah and their ideological goal of destroying Israel, that day will come, and Israel will have to defend its citizens. So wisely, again, in my view, they are conducting these drills and, hey, sending a message as well in the process to the Iranian regime and Hezbollah that we are prepared, we know what you're doing, we won't be taken by surprise. Another element of these drills, which I think is interesting, is that Israel is also preparing for civilian strife in the event of a future war. We saw back in May 2021 during that Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, cities in Israel, mixed towns and cities where Jews and Arabs live side by side, flared up with violence and unrest. That's another factor that Israel is weighing as they look forward to, not look forward, but look ahead to possible conflicts. And they certainly took notes, did the Israel Defense Forces, during that May 2021 war. 11 days of intense fighting, and again, intensity on the streets of Israel, civil strife as well. And the IDF is taking the lessons from that conflict and looking ahead to what the picture will look like, the landscape, in a much more severe war with Hezbollah. One big question I have is that, will Iran's ring of fire, that full ring of fire that surrounds Israel, be activated? We have, obviously, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, Islamic Jihad in Gaza, the Shia militias in Iraq surrounding Israel with rockets, but also attack drones in large numbers. Will they be activated, and what could trigger the next conflict? We may have had an indicator over the weekend on Saturday in a rare daytime strike. Israeli missiles reportedly struck a convoy of weapons, Hezbollah and Iranian weapons, transiting near the city of Damascus, the Syrian capital. This convoy was struck by Israeli missiles. It was reportedly headed from Syria on its way to Lebanon into the hands of Hezbollah, no doubt. Know that things are coming to a head, and that's not even mentioning the Iran nuclear program and discussions there. There's more and more discussion in Jerusalem about what to do about this looming and growing Iran nuclear threat. Certainly, Iran right now is kind of playing games with Europe and the U.S. in terms of coming back to the negotiating table and reviving that disastrous Iran nuclear deal. So really right now, there are no attractive options on the table, and Jerusalem and Israeli leaders, this government of Naftali Bennett, may have some very difficult decisions to make in the not-so-distant future. Thanks so much for joining us this time here in the newscast. Until tomorrow, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.